I look forward to working with you and Vice Chair Collins and all the members of this subcommittee as we return to regular order and work to find common ground to build a strong competitive economy for families across our country. Today's hearing is really an important opportunity to assess what resources that is going to require, and it does come amid some very stark reminders that keeping our country strong means keeping our infrastructure strong. We all know about the recent trail derailment and spill in East Palestine, Ohio. There's also one last week in the Swinomish Tribal Reservation in my home state of Washington. And we've seen some disturbingly close calls in air travel lately. So as we are writing the funding bills for this year ahead, we absolutely have to remember that keeping our families safe and our nation competitive is, of course, about defense spending, but it's also important to remind ourselves that safety and our families' safety is dependent on non-defense spending as well. And when it comes to protecting our families, we have to make sure that our people and our goods get safely and efficiently from point A to point B. And when it comes to keeping our economy competitive, we can't compete with China without well-run ports who ship American goods out to the world. And I'm proud to say my home state of Washington has some of the best. We know we can't compete with without strong public transportation networks that connect our communities and are accessible to everybody and strengthen our local economies and get people to work and school and more. And of course we can't compete when it comes to clean energy and reducing emissions without investing in green transportation. So this bipartisan infrastructure law that we passed laid a really good, strong foundation for an infrastructure decade. And now we have to build on that to make sure that we can complete the projects in our communities that are so badly needed, like the I-5 bridge project in Southwest Washington you're well aware of, or expanding Sound Transit's light rail system. So I look forward to hearing more from Secretary Buttigieg about why projects like this are important and what we need to keep that momentum going. But I wanted to ask you today about the recent derailments in Ohio and in my state, and how they really demonstrate some significant vulnerabilities in our nation's rail system. We've been here before with crude oil incidents, and I worked with the administration then through this subcommittee actually to require comprehensive oil spill response plans and funding to improve safety practices and training for our short line and regional railroads. Secretary, there are just a few examples of steps we took to increase safety around crude oil. Could you expand those efforts now for other hazardous materials?
Thank you for your attention to this issue and for the question. The short answer is yes. Often what happens is that America learns from an experience, a disaster, and I know that your work and others on this committee was part of responding to some horrific crashes, derailments, and incidents that took place in the early 2000s that led to things like the creation of the category of the high hazard flammable unit train. And while that was, I think, a successful response to that type of tragedy, questions arose in the wake of East Palestine from people who asked a very reasonable question looking at that horrific smoke column and fireball coming out of the vinyl chloride controlled burn, that if this train did not meet the legal or technical definition of a high hazard flammable train, what would? Yeah. And so I think this is compelling us to revise and review both the HHFUT definitions in particular, and then more broadly, the authorities and the definitions that we're working with, some of which are in statute, and we welcome the legislation on a bipartisan basis that's emerging in this chamber to do some things that we think are important, from stiffer fines for safety violations to specific concrete technical measures that could make a difference. We are also acting with the authorities that we do have. Recent safety advisories on valve caps for tank cars are just one example, and are calling on industry not to wait for us to require it of them, to do the right thing on their end. And with regard to your question here, I would point to the importance of early notification for communities when hazardous material is passing through them. That is still not as rigorous as we believe it ought to be. The legislation would raise the bar on that, but I don't think that industry should wait for legislation. Yeah. We certainly won't, to view that as the right thing to do.
Yeah, well, I know this budget was prepared before those derailments, but can you talk a little bit how you're using existing resources to increase rail safety, and maybe what's in this budget that will help you with that?
Yes, well, the budget was proposed before the East Palestine tragedy crash took place. It already reflects a number of steps that we have been wanting to take or expand, including growing FRA's capacity with regard to railroad safety. And I would divide that into a couple of relevant categories. One has to do with enforcement and compliance, but another research. So, for example, the wayside detection devices that could have played a role here are something that have been developed partly through collaboration with the FRA, and obviously we need to continue looking at how that technology could help to prevent future derailments and crashes. So it's certainly reflected here in the budget, increasing the agency's railroad safety personnel, expanding inspection and audit capabilities, enhancing data analysis that'll help us identify root causes and better interpret the NTSB data that comes as they do their independent work, and increasing the stakeholder outreach and partnerships. And just to give you one example of what's in the budget, there's $17 million for the automated track inspection program and $4.5 million to support efforts to expand the confidential close call reporting system, which we think is important. And of course, we'll continue evaluating what else could make a difference as we look to the future.
Well, thank you very much, and I will submit my remaining questions for the record, but really appreciate your being here. And again, look forward to working with you as we put this bill together.